Moving right along. Moving right along, we're on C-SPAN. We're on C-SPAN. We're on National Public Radio. We are, or maybe not. I don't know. Take your seats, ladies and gentlemen. We'll begin the program. Everybody have enough to eat, and we trust that you all did. Those of you from out of town, we really want to welcome all of you here to our nation's capital. We're very, very lucky. We've gone another 24 hours without the abolishing of the Department of Education. And now, those of you who live here, those of you who live in the District of Columbia, particularly those of you who live in Cleveland Park, we have good news. The plow will be there in the morning, all right? Good. When I first started doing my show on public television 20 years ago, and I didn't know at the time how many PBS stations around the country were carrying the show, and I remember I was here where I live. I live in Washington for the same reason a coal miner lives near the shaft, and I remember meeting a lady from Carbondale, you know, and she mentioned the show. Well, I couldn't believe it. I said, "You mean you get my show all the way out there in Carbondale, Illinois?" You know? She said, "We see it, but we don't get it." So that's my problem. Now, there's an old saying in my business, you got to know your audience. And I don't know, to me, this looks like a fundraiser for Steve Forbes. I don't know, maybe it's just me, you know, flat tax certainly catching on. It doesn't exactly kill all the lawyers, but it does away with the accountants, so at least it's a start. And everybody talking about Steve Forbes' wealth, and they're comparing it with Ross Perot. There's a big difference between Forbes and Ross Perot. When Forbes' daughter was married, there were no Martians at the wedding. This is certainly a bigger audience than I had the other night, a very small audience, tiny, tiny, minuscule audience. It was a political rally. Gays and lesbians for Pat Buchanan. Good to see you. Anyway, the consensus of Paul Simon for many, many years, and I really mean this sincerely, and everybody, both sides of the aisle, are in full agreement that Paul Simon is a good man, he is a decent man, he is a gentle man. However, in today's political climate, these are his negatives. And so, as our guest of honor prepares to join the law firm of Bradley, Cohn, Nunn, Heflin, Hatfield, Schroeder, Simon, and Garfunkel, it occurs to me, and as I travel around the country, I have for many years been of the idea that the whole population of the United States is divided into two groups, depending upon who you think of when you hear the name Paul Simon. Now, other than the political junkies in the room and a few people in Illinois, I'm sorry, but most people think of Paul Simon, the folk singer of Simon and Garfunkel, and a few of the elite think of the senior senator from Illinois. And so, being in showbiz, I figured out a way, or at least an attempt, to imitate both Paul's Simon simultaneously, all right? You're in the mood for that? Just take a second here. Paul Simon, the senator, and Paul Simon, the folk singer, together. And here we go. Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus love you more than you will know. Ho, ho, ho. That's the biggest laugh I ever got with that routine. You know, there's a lot of talk about the current mood of Washington. We're in it's kind of a funk, I don't know, in the last year or so. Do you remember the people who used to hang out in the airport terminal, the LaRouches, the followers of Lyndon LaRouche, holding up their crude posters, spouting out their nutty ideas? You notice they're not in the airport anymore, no? They've all been elected to the House of Representatives. And so a year ago they arrived and their clarion call was loud and clear, no more business as usual. And now what do we have a year later? No more business, period. And so if you succeed in shutting down the government 3 times in 3 months, you have literally succeeded in overthrowing the government. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that for relative political stability, Italy is looking better every day. I saw where Bob Dole the other day went to see the movie Animal House in preparation to go and visit the Dartmouth fraternity where the movie was made. Either that, he was preparing to visit with the House of Representatives. And I remember when Newt Gingrich, he's good for me. I mean, Newt Gingrich, let's face it, is a gift that keeps on giving. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was thinking of maybe slowing down in my career a little bit, take some time off, and then Newt became Speaker of the House. I said, no. No, not with those statements last year when he was saying, quote, women should not be in combat because, quote, they get an infection in the trenches, whereas men like to roll around in the mud like little piglets, unquote. Well, that ought to boost army enlistments, right? And then he went out to Boys Town, Nebraska, to tout the old 1930s movie Boys Town as a solution for solving the child welfare problem, the same way, I guess, you solve the adultery problem with the movie Scarlet Letter and the Ross Perot problem with the movie Get Shorty. And then he closed down the government because President Clinton made him sit in the back of Air Force One, made him Negro for a day. And so it goes on and on. Now, I remember when the Republicans were in the White House, and it was in the 1980s, and the current crop now, they profess to be great fans of Ronald Reagan. And that rings kind of hollow. It really does, because they don't have Reagan's wit, they don't have the style, the class of Reagan, or our guest of honor, Mr. Simon. And for example, when during the Iran-Contra crisis, a reporter asked Ronald Reagan, he said, Mr. President, he said, did CIA Director William Casey carry on covert operations without you knowing about it? Reagan answered, not to my knowledge. Ronald Reagan raised taxes. Nobody minded. He said, it's okay. It's the Gipper, right? George Bush raised taxes, had his head handed to him because he had that goofy soundbite, read my lips, no new taxes. And 2 years later, he had to say, we're going to have to raise taxes. Raise a little bit there. During the 80s, when Reagan was in the White House, the Republicans themselves were, in fact, telling the following story of Ronald Reagan stranded on a desert island with Muammar Gaddafi, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and Newt Gingrich. Reagan only had 2 bullets, so he shot Gingrich twice. There are many, many unanswered questions facing this beleaguered city tonight, ladies and gentlemen. No question about it, and I know you're all Democrats, most of you, but there are, when we look at the situation of Whitewater and Travelgate, and we ask ourselves the question, ladies and gentlemen, regarding Hillary Clinton, have we reached a point in our country where we would punish someone for lying to Al D'Amato? Senator D'Amato, who several years ago had his own problem with ethics, none were found. Many, many questions. In fact, you could make it multiple choice. Mrs. Clinton's aide at the White House, Carolyn Huber, found the missing Whitewater legal documents, A, on a table on the 3rd floor in the living area, B, in a box of knickknacks with some costume jewelry and the old health care plan, or C, in Sox's cat box. These are the questions, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and when they have the accusations and the charges that Mrs. Clinton is conniving and duplicitous, that only points to one thing. She is a duplicitous lawyer. A duplicitous lawyer. And I yearn for the simpler days in America when first ladies were not embroiled in controversy, when Nancy Reagan was content to stay in the White House picking out the china, consulting with her astrologers, and running the government. We remember that. And so the other day, New York Times columnist William Safire calls the First Lady a, quote, congenital liar, and the president threatens to punch Safire in the nose. That would be the fight of the century from Madison Square Garden. And now in this corner, wearing purple trunks, weighing 150 pounds, the intellectual conservative journalist from New York City and former speechwriter for Spiro Agnew, coining the phrase nattering nabobs of negativism, Bully Boy Bill Safire. And in this corner from Hope, Arkansas, weighing 100 pounds, more than his opponent, wearing silly little jogging shorts 2 sizes too small, who is upset with his opponent for calling his wife a congenital liar, and is also upset with Paula Jones for calling him a genital liar. You're very good. This is an awkward segue. But the former governor of Vermont, I don't know, I just couldn't think of any way to get to it's a problem you have as a master of ceremonies, but it's changing the mood, but not necessarily, because she is delightful, and you all know her, and she is a very good friend of the Simons, former governor of the state of Vermont, and the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education, the Honorable Madeline Kunin. Incidentally, the senator's bow tie is a real one. It's a real one that you tie yourself. His shirt's a clip-on, however, so As Dr. Ted Sanders makes his way to the stage, I spoke at the University of Southern Illinois about 10 years ago, and in Carbondale, what they tell every speaker, and I thought I was the only one, they say, you'll either go on at 8 o'clock or you'll go on at 20 after 8. And I said, well, what determines that? And they said, well, there are railroad tracks that run right through the center of Carbondale, and if the train is on time, half the audience will be cut off and they will be late. So that's the last thing I'm going to tell you about Carbondale. This gentleman is the former Deputy Secretary and Acting Secretary of the Department of Education, and last July he became Chancellor of the University of Southern Illinois, Dr. Ted Sanders. Please welcome him. Thank you very much. As Dr. Lewis Sullivan makes his way, please, to the stage, as you know, he was the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Do you realize, I just happen to think of this, do you know if the current Secretary of Health and Human Services were to be married to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, her name would be Donna Shalala Shalikashvili? Just happened to think of that. Dr. Sullivan was Secretary of HHS longer than anybody else, 47 months, and that's another thing. Well, that's a record. You know we've been 13 months without a Surgeon General, which is, it's true, it's part of Philip Morris's contract with America. He, of course, was the founding dean and director of the Medical Education Department of Morehouse College, where he has returned, the Honorable Dr. Lewis Sullivan.